trying to get through the Christmas season. It's not always that easy when you're doing services during Christmas because you're boxed into a theme, right? You can't get up here and do Easter songs on Christmas. It's also hard sometimes preaching and talking during holidays because you're also tied into a theme. So I looked through all the Gospels and all the Christmas stories and the Scriptures, and the one I'm going to use today is not in any of those. We're in the book of John, chapter 1, verses 9 through 14, and it's going to be on the screen. The true light that gives life to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. So far we're not recognizing him and not receiving him. That's not a great track record so far. Yet for all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We've all heard that scripture before. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, you know, as we grow up in the church, and even if we didn't grow up in the church, we've all heard the Christmas story in the Bible. One interesting thing about the Christmas story in the Bible is what we teach and talk about is kind of a mashup of all the Christmas stories in the Bible, if y'all ever read them. Like you'll read one of the Gospels and say, hey, where did the shepherds go? And then you'll read the other Gospel and say, I thought there was some magi in here. So what we have for our Christmas story that we grew up hearing and talk about in church and see on the TV Christmas shows is kind of a mixture of 4 stories that are slammed together into one story. And it makes it a good story. You got all kinds of characters going on, animals. Animals are always good in the story, right? You got animals and mangers and all kinds of stuff. Well, 2,000 years ago, when Jesus came to the world, he came to be the Messiah. Now, the people at that time knew what the Messiah was. It's all in the Old Testament. And they knew what to expect the Messiah to be. And here's the issue and the problem they had 2,000 years ago. And the reason 2,000 years ago, a lot of people, when they heard about the Christmas story, said, that's not the Messiah. Because what they were expecting, if you look in the Old Testament, was a king from the house of David, the powerful David, the powerful king. They expected someone who would probably come from privilege, who would probably be rich, who would probably be a military leader. And what they expected the Messiah to do is come in and whip up on the Romans, pick them up, and throw them out of Israel. And then this person was going to come and rebuild the temple. Okay? That is what they were expecting. And our Christmas story that we all know, guess what they got? They didn't get any of that. They got absolutely none of that. They got a person who was born illegitimate into poverty, who was born in a manger or in a stable, who was from the house of David and basically name alone. He was the people like, you watch these shows about the royal family, and like some of the royals show up at the wedding and you see them and they all say, well, he's in the royal family, but they don't claim him in the royal family. You know, he's like the crazy uncle. Jesus was in the house of David in the part that was the low rent. Okay? He was born into poverty. He was a manual laborer. So basically everything that the Israelites at the time expected is exactly what they didn't get. Does everybody understand that? Matter of fact, when the disciples started showing up, Philip meets Jesus and goes to Nathanael and says, Nathanael, I have found the Messiah. He is from Galilee and Nazareth. And you know what Nathanael said? Does anybody know? Nothing good can come from Nazareth. So even the disciples, when they hear that Jesus is from the circumstances he is, they're not even impressed. They're turned off immediately. So the question this morning I want to talk about is this. The Jews were expecting something, okay? And we know God can do anything, right? Why did he choose to send the Messiah to the Jews in those circumstances? Why did he not have Jesus come in the chariot with a whole army of angels and whip up the Romans? Why did he choose to send Jesus to us in the way that he did? Why Joseph? Why Mary? Why the manger? Why the stable? Why Galilee? And this morning I think I've got two reasons that I think God did this. Number one is, for lack of a better word, try again. He had tried everything else. He had tried everything else. The whole Old Testament in the Bible is this. Everybody ready? He set Adam and Eve up in the garden. They screwed up. Okay, that's in Genesis chapter probably 2. The whole Old Testament, from Genesis chapter 2 to the end, right before Matthew, is about God trying to fix that relationship. And poor God, he tried everything, right? He tried everything. The first thing he did was he gave us everything in the garden, right? He gave us paradise. He gave us all the food we could have. He put us over the animals. He let us run around naked and not even worry about it. We messed that up. So you would think if you're a parent and give your child everything, it ought to work. Well, it didn't work. So the next thing he did was God came in and said, you know what? This is not working. These fools have gone off the rails. I'm going to try something drastic. Let me try a flood and start over. So he comes in. The flood comes. He zaps them all. But it still doesn't work. The Israelites still don't do right. So then he says, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to enslave them. I'm going to get the Egyptians to take them and enslave them. And that still didn't work. And then he said, you know what? I've now enslaved them. Why don't I deliver them? And he goes to Moses and he says, deliver them. And you know what happens for the next 40 years? The Israelites complain. The Israelites complain. That's why Moses takes the Israelites and go into a giant circle in a squiggly line for 40 years. Because they complain. Okay, so then he sets them up in the nice promised land. And you know what they do? They complain. Then he sets, you know what they say? We want a king. So guess what he does? He gives them a king. You know what they do then? They don't want the king. The king's too mean. The king taxes us. God, how could you do this to us? So then God goes in, once again, wipes them out, sends them to Nebuchadnezzar, and they still turn away from God. Then God sends a whole bunch of prophets. You know all those prophets in the Bible? Ezra, Nehemiah, Ezekiel, all those guys. All they say over and over is basically turn and come back to God. Every prophet, I mean, you can read all the books, they're great, but that's pretty much what every one of them says. And you know what they do? Nothing. Nothing. So God, I think, has tried everything he could think of to reestablish the relationship that he had with us in the garden. And every one of them has failed. Every year when we do the Christmas songs in the warehouse, I usually just sit constantly for a couple weeks and listen to Christmas songs. They're like banging around in my head, you know, Jingle Bells, Frosty the Snowman, everywhere. Trying to find songs that I think will work in the warehouse. And a few years ago, I was listening to a Christmas album by this guy named Jason Gray. He's a Christian singer. And, you know, I'm kind of zoning out. You know, I'm tired of it. I mean, how many times can you listen to Silent Night and not roll your eyes back in your head? And he sings this song called I Will Find a Way. And it starts off, I think the first line is like, you know, something about a tenement apartment. The young woman was locked in a tenement apartment. And I kind of jumped up. I said, that does not sound like Rudolph. So I backed it up and actually listened to it. And then, you know, I started doing some YouTube research like we do. And I found out that he had written that song based on a short story by this guy named Walter Wannergan. And the short story is called An Advent Monologue. So I ordered the short story book off eBay, opened it up to the Advent monologue. I'm expecting to see something about angels. Same thing. Woman's living in a tenement apartment. She's poor. She's scared. The story is about a protagonist who is God, who does everything he can to connect with this woman. Okay? So the first thing he does is he goes and he knocks on her door real quiet. And she won't open the door. Because of all the bad stuff that has happened to her in her life, she's scared. She's scared. She's been beaten down so much. She's been ostracized so much. She's scared. So then he says, well, maybe I'll knock a little bit harder. And then he bangs on the door. And you know what she says then? I'm not answering that. That's probably the bill collector. Or that's probably the super wanting his money. So then God, the protagonist, who's God, says, you know what? I'm just going to bang the door down. And then she says, basically, well, maybe that's not going to work, God says, because the woman may have a heart attack if I do that. So finally, God decides that the only way he can get to this woman, it's not going to work with force. It's not going to work being quiet. He says the only way I think I can get to her is if I come into the world through her. That if you're scared of the world, but you're a mom, you'll be able to relate to your child. And so I think that's one of the reasons that God decided at the time to come into the world through man. He had tried everything else. Think about it. He had tried all the ways in the world to interact with man. So finally God makes the decision that the way I'm going to come into the world is through man. So I think that's one reason he did it. In Genesis, Adam and Eve had the perfect relationship with God. And it was ruined. It was ruined. So what God is doing in this Christmas season is he is trying to fix it. He's trying to make a path to man. You know, what happens in Adam and Eve's story when they sin? They hide from God, right? We're studying in our Sunday school class right now different religions. We've been talking about Hinduism, Buddhism, all kinds of different religions. And you know what I realized when we've been studying those? In every one of those religions, and probably every religion that I can think of in the world, the whole story behind the religion is man seeking God. Okay? They're going to God. They're trying to figure out what we can do to please God. Some of them are, what can we do to get a better afterlife? Some of them are, if I get reincarnated, I want to come back in a cool animal. So what can I do? What can I do to seek God? Some religions, even the people chase God. There's even people in the world who chase God. What we learn from the Christmas story is in every other religion in the world, man is seeking God. And by sending Jesus to us as a mortal, as a poor child, it shows us that God is seeking man. Christianity is the only religion when God seeks man instead of man chasing God. It's the only religion where instead of looking at God up in the sky or on a mountain or in the heavens, that God chose to come down from whatever mountain, whatever heaven, whatever place of power. God chose to come down and be with us. So that's the first reason I think that God came down. The second reason is, I think I can best, there's a story I read one time about a little girl. Somebody in our church a few weeks ago was telling me they can't get their child to sleep in their own bed. Parents, anybody ever dealt with this? They're telling me all this stuff they're doing. They're doing this. So then they buy some stuffed animals and they get a big, teddy bear. That doesn't work. They get some toys. We had this thing with our kids that was like, I called it the fish. It was like a mobile, and you hit a button and it sounded like bubbles and all kinds of stuff. They tried the fish, everything, And this parent in this story basically goes to his daughter, and says, now, here's what we're going to do. Now, I just want you to know that when you go to sleep at night, God is in the bed with you. Okay? God is right there. Now, if you can't sleep with God, what are you going to do? So, that night, you hear the child come down the hall, they crawl in bed, and they say, I told you, God is in your bed. And she said, Mommy, Daddy, I need a God I can snuggle with. The second reason God came down like He did was He wanted to be a God we could snuggle with. He wanted to be a God that when people encountered Jesus, they could reach out and they could touch Him. Right? There's so many stories in the Bible where Jesus interacted with people. And almost in every one of those stories, you know what Jesus did? He touched them. Some way. He touched them. He reached out. He put His hand on them. I imagine from what I've read, Jesus was probably a hugger. Right? I'm definitely not a hugger. I'm the one that when you hug, I do my arms like this. But I imagine that Jesus was a hugger. See, God came down to us as a man because He wanted us to relate to Him. Right? We wanted to be able to say, Jesus, I'm struggling right now. I'm sad. And you understand me because one day your friend Lazarus died. And I know you know what being sad means. There's times in the Bible where Jesus went away from His disciples and He dealt with loneliness, and He dealt with fear, and He dealt with uncertainty, and He dealt with pain, all this stuff. God sent us Jesus to relate to us, to be like us, to be somebody we could snuggle with. The third reason I think God did it like He did, sent Jesus down like He did, was I think really God was trying to remove labels. Remove labels. See, in their society, there were people just like in our society now. We label people all the time. We label people because of their social status. We label people because of their monetary status. We label people because of what they do for a living. Or we label people because of their sexual orientation or of vices we think they don't deserve. We label people all the time. All the time. And I think God, by sending Jesus down like He did, He was trying to remove the labels. He was trying to remove the barriers that He saw at the time and that are still here today. He was trying to show us that Jesus was more like the people look down on. You know, Matthew, in his Christmas story, I've talked about this before. I encourage you to read it. Read Matthew 1. You know what's in Matthew 1? There's no angels. There's no wise men. There's no animals. Matthew 1 starts off with a genealogy of Jesus. And the first thing you want to do is skip it. Who wants to read, you know, Ruth begat so-and-so and David begat so-and-so, and it's boring and read it sometime. Because of all the disciples that Jesus called, who was labeled the most? Matthew. He was labeled as a tax collector. He was a sinner. He was a traitor. He was a bad dude in the eyes of the Israelites. So when Jesus sat down to set out the genealogy of Jesus, you know what He did? He put things in there that most people wouldn't put. Back then, when you wrote a genealogy and you were a king, you know what you put? All the good stuff. All the good stuff. You know what you didn't put? The battles that you lost, the crazy children that you had, the mistakes that you had made. So Matthew in this genealogy, he put 4 people in here that makes you scratch your head. The first 2 are Tamar and Rahab. And you know who Tamar was? Tamar was basically a seductress that got somebody to leave his wife for her, for lack of a better word. Then you have Rahab. Y'all know who Rahab is? Rahab is the prostitute that when the Israelites came into Jericho, she helped them out. See, Matthew put Rahab and Tamar in there, who were a seductress and who were a harlot. And he did this to show us that Jesus came to remove the label that was on them. This next person he put in there is Ruth. Ruth was a Moab person from Moab. The Jews hated the Moabites, hated them. But he put Ruth in there because she was labeled as an outsider, and he put Ruth in there to show that Jesus came to take away the label. Then he put David in there. Of all the stuff David did, of all the great things David did, you know what he highlights? The story of Bathsheba and David. Because he says, there's David who was married to Bathsheba, who was, in parentheses in your Bible, Uriah's wife. You know who Uriah was? Uriah was the guy that David had basically killed so he could steal his wife. So out of all the stuff that David did good, Matthew put, quotes, Uriah's wife in there to show us that David should not be labeled as a sinner and a murderer, but he should be labeled as a king. Jesus came to take the labels away, and Jesus came to take Matthew's label away. He took Matthew's label away from sinner, tax collector, general bad dude, to disciple, friend of Jesus. Jesus came because there are too many labels. There are too many labels. In our world, there's too many walls. And we're trying to build a whole wall around our country right now. There's too many walls and there's too many labels. So, as the band comes up today, what I want us to understand about why Jesus came like he did is that he came because what was most important to God and most important to the people at the end of the day was relationship. Can you imagine how fortunate we are as Christians today to be in a position where we have a God that we can have a relationship with? We can have a God who has walked the earth and gone through the same stuff as us. And so when we read the Christmas story, understand this is not how they wanted it in the Old Testament. They wanted a king. They wanted a king. And they got basically a beggar. And when we read our Christmas story, remember these 4 words and apply them to this. Emmanuel, God with us. Not God over us. Not God above us. But Emmanuel, God with us. Let us pray. Father, thank you for sending your Son to die for us on the cross. And thank you for sending him in a way that we can relate to, that we can snuggle up to, that we can know that you sent him to us in the way that you did, as a way that we could take away our labels, as a way that we could find a peace and an understanding with someone who has walked with us and walked on this earth. And Father, as we go through this season, help us remember what is important and help us remember that yours is an example that we should follow every day. We ask all these things in your name.